Well, it's such a pleasure to be talking to Geraint Anderson, who was better known as Cityboy, a man who gave the people in the financial services sector in the UK quite a few gears. He had a column that was in the newspaper that you'd get when you went onto the tube. So you can be sure it was very well read. As Cityboy, hilarious. We then got him to write a column for us at MoneyWeb back when I was there, obviously. And I didn't know what had happened to him since. But up pops a book called How to Con Friends and Manipulate People. Now, Geraint, I knew there had to be a follow-up to How to Win Friends and Influence People of Dale Carnegie's, but my goodness, this is it's a lot of fun, and I think you got to start right at the outset. It's not a template on how to be a psycho. It's actually read the last chapter first, and then you'll see you are using humor to say, "Whoa, be careful what you might become if you, I suppose, get too involved in what can we call it? The 10 commandments of being a corporate animal."
That's it. Yeah. I mean, it came from my 12 years in the city. And then I was looking around at the world full stop. And I was looking at people like Andrew Tate, the manosphere, so-called manosphere guru. I was looking at people like Trump, Elon Musk, one of your South African buddies. and, and I was thinking, just a minute, the values these people are espousing seem to be kind of don't have empathy, win at all costs, no conscience. People are kind of pawns in your game to be manipulated. And suddenly I thought, just 1 second, this sounds suspiciously like being a psychopath. So I took their so-called ethos, their kind of strategies, to their logical conclusion. And the idea is by doing so, I would expose just how ridiculous and how dangerous they are because, you may succeed with some of the advice that I put in the book, but, you really become the very worst version of yourself. And you probably, unless, of course, you are a real psychopath, won't be able to sleep at night. So it's a kind of parody, and the advice is disturbingly effective. That's what I was just saying to you earlier that, someone came into a book signing I did in Canary Wharf in London, and they literally said, just to be clear, this is a parody. And I was like, well, in the final chapter, I do recommend that you kill your chief executive in order to get his job. So I like to think this is a parody, but the advice is disturbingly effective, Alec. That's the weird thing, and I've got a feeling that when it comes out in America, there's a quite high chance that actually people are gonna take it as a manual for how to succeed on Wall Street.
Yeah. Well, you said it's done quite well in South Africa. So I wonder if we haven't got people who are following it as a template.
Well, that's it, man. My publisher just said, "Oh, you know what? There's 2 places, 2 regions we didn't expect this book to be doing well in. One is India, and the other South Africa." And I thought, "South Africa? Oh, it's my old mate Alec. I used to write a column for him." And, I don't know what the financial situation and how finance is in South Africa, but what I do know is that in London it seems to have got worse and worse. In terms of manipulation, and that's because my personal belief is a bit like corruption seeps down from the top. If you have a corrupt leader, then his deputies become corrupt and so forth, and it seeps down through entire society. When you have someone like Trump and various other so-called strongmen who've come in since the 2008 financial crisis to kind of sort out their countries and offer extreme solutions to extreme problems, it seeps down through society. So if I was an American, for example, let's say working in a kind of some municipal form of some kind, or maybe some minor official, I'd look up at my boss and I'd go, that guy lies all the time. 50,000 lies and counting since 2016. That guy is extremely vengeful on anyone who dares cross him. That man is someone who will only have loyalists underneath him who do exactly what he says and will, and so forth. And I suddenly thought he would surely conclude that that is the way you succeed, because after all, he has done rather well for himself. He is the most powerful man in the world. So really, the book is a corporate self-help book, but obviously it's trying to remind the reader that therein lies madness. If you do go down this path, you and society will not ultimately benefit.
It's great fun. It really is, as long as you approach it in that respect. The Prince Machiavelli, was that part of your uh, intention to show what he was showing back in Florence? Right? That's a classic. Maybe yours will be too.
Yes, I cite, I think, 3 books as, guides for one, of course, is Trump's The Art of the Deal, which is an extraordinary tome when you read it with the benefit of hindsight of what's happened now, never admit defeat, win at all costs, vengeance is an acceptable thing to do, use he calls it, well, lie, basically. He just, he says lying is fine. Then the other book is The Art of War by Sun Tzu, the Chinese guy who, as you know, in every single Wall Street film, they require at least one broker to mention it every 20 or so minutes because it's deemed to be the kind of the guidebook. But ultimately, and I think you've nailed it here, Alec, is the real what I'm trying to do, if you like, is update Machiavelli's The Prince and say, okay, his ethos is ethics have no real place if you're trying to win and this is, Florence, and I think it was the 16th century, was it? Um, and the victory will justify any actions, and it's only a fool who will have ideals or morals of any kind. And this is, in some ways, I would say, an updated version of that, but with its tongue firmly in its cheek. As I said before, the slightly disturbing thing is that the tricks that I myself used to do, when I look back at them, they were kind of mildly psychopathic. I'm talking about things, for example, towards bonus time, I would blow my own trumpet in an as much as humanly possible, in a subtle way, of course, to ensure that I was stealing thunder off colleagues who perhaps had actually just as big a role in some deal I'd done or some major bit of commission that I'd garnered. Likewise, I used to do this other, with the benefit of hindsight, slightly dubious thing where I'd pretend to have conversations with headhunters. You know, I would do this in a way, and what I mean by that is, okay, so it's coming up to September, October. You're not 100% sure you've fully delivered, and so but you know that you are quite sought after because I used to focus on. So what you do is you just have muffled conversations just within earshot of your line manager saying, "Look, call me back later. Let's call me back on my mobile at lunchtime. Let's discuss this." Just to make sure, keep them on their toes. So I look back at my own behavior, Alec, and I think, just a minute, you weren't exactly the best best version of yourself, Geraint. And it's actually got to the stage now, something quite interesting has happened. I've lost control of the narrative regarding this book. So the Times did an article, I wrote it, but they headlined it, and it said I was a Cityboy psychopath. Likewise, I did a podcast, quite sort of with a guy here, and he framed it as I spoke with a psychopath. And suddenly I realized that I completely lost control of the narrative. And now people are saying, actually, I am a psychopath. And I started looking at some of my behavior and I looked at the checklist. And I hate to say it, but I'm a kind of, I think I'm about an 8 or 9 out of 40 on the psychopath checklist. You have to be over 25 to be a psychopath, but the average American man is 4. So I'm now going to be actually assessed clinically by a psychologist and in the next week or two. And remember, a psychopath is not some bloke, or generally not some bloke waiting down an alley with a machete to chop you up. A psychopath has certain traits that are extremely useful in banking. So I was going to say we're fearless. They are quite fearless. They're uber confident. They have glib charm, superficial charm. They are manipulative. They're ruthless. They lack a conscience. They also have things such as um, an ability to read others. They like high risk jobs like finance, and they hate jobs that require lots of training and so forth. So I've lost control of the narrative, and now I'm actually going to assess whether indeed I am where I am on the psychopathy spectrum.
But if you were a proper psychopath, you wouldn't have shared all the secrets with the rest of the world, surely.
Well, that's true, but remember, I'm out of the game now. So, if I was still in the city, of course, I'd be holding them close to my chest and ensuring that no one else, well, I mean, some of them are quite well known, but now that I'm left the city, I'm now essentially living a life of writing books. It's I felt it quite nice sort of sequel to Cityboy, in the sense that Cityboy was a memoir exposing the kind of the reckless greed that lay at the heart of finance in the noughties. That was a period. So Gordon Brown, the prime minister who supposedly saved the world with his economic shenanigans post 2008, um, he called the period between the mid-90s and 2008 as the age of financial irresponsibility. And funnily enough, that was exactly the period that I was in finance between 2006, sorry, 1996 and 2008. And, I I think what this book's trying to do is expose something other than short-term reckless greed. It's trying to expose a particular mentality that has become pretty commonplace in the corporate sector and, of course, in politics. For example, those guys in Silicon Valley who are selling us and our children social media apps and so forth that are addictive by design, and yet they are keeping their own kids in forest schools. Forest schools are those ones where you kind of, play around with bits of twig and stuff and make, bivouacs or whatever. And yet they have strict contracts with their nannies where they refuse to allow them to have any screens in front of their kids. So they know the dangers they're creating, and and we've seen it across the world. I have a house in Mexico, and I see that, and all the kids these days are just playing on their addictive by design apps, and I find that quite psychopathic behavior. To me, that and the hypocrisy obviously is ridiculous too. So I see problems in both finance and politics. And as regards the problems in politics, I think it all comes down to the 2008 financial crisis because, as you know, what happened then was three things. One, real wages really didn't grow, when taking into account inflation for a long period. So people thought, the American dream is false, and that people were getting pretty angry about that. Two, we had a massive increase in inequality because interest rates stayed low for so long. If you had assets like shares or property, you became richer and richer because, of course, money was cheap, debt was cheap. There was no point keeping money in the bank. You had to invest it. And three, the banks and the bankers were bailed out. And when you so that just confirmed all the conspiracy theories about the deep state, about, the elites being in some kind of cabal, looking after their own. And I put down a lot of the political developments that have happened, be it Brexit, Trump, or these other strong men that have appeared across the world, down to the 2008 financial crisis.
It's so interesting. There are many parallels, but I don't know if you've come across a guy called Ryan Holiday. He's quite famous now for being a person who talks about the Stoics. He writes about the Stoics, and he clearly has transformed. But he wrote a wonderful book called "Trust Me, I'm Lying," and he gave you the inside track on the communications industry, the PR industry, if you like, and how they manipulated journalists, the message, and their clients were very happy to get the message, true or false, into the public domain, and people would act on it. And I think that's a bit of a guide book for anyone wanting to understand that industry. A similar Bob Cialdini's book, Influence, which explains how others can influence you because of some deep seated traits that we have as human beings. And it was recommended, in fact, by Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett at one of the AGMs there. The unfortunate thing is, both with Holiday's book and with Cialdini's book, and maybe yours, some are going to pick it up and take it literally as a guidebook, as a way to go forward. Did you ever consider that would be a possible problem?
I have, and in fact, you've hit the nail on the head there about a concern I've had. So, when I was talking about it with my agent, they said, "Look, you have to give proper advice. This can't just be flim flam. You have to give stuff from a genuine insider." And remember, without blowing my own trumpet and sounding too much like a narcissist stroke psychopath, I went from being an intern to heading up the second highest ranked equity team in London in about 9 years. And I then gave a draft of this book to some American friends, and they just came back to me and said, "Geraint, people are going to, in America, which, without generalizing about an entire nation, has a slight issue with irony, a slight issue understanding irony, saying one thing and meaning quite the opposite. They're going to take this as a manual, mate." And I was like, "Oh no." So what I hope is that the final chapter, which is called But Seriously, Folks, gives a fairly comprehensive and believable and convincing account of what the book's intention actually is to help you identify psychopaths and the tricks they use. Because one of the things I think, and especially in this world of AI, that the importance of education really for my children, what I think the most is to see through the BS, to not want to use a unnecessary rude word, that is prevalent, especially with obviously the internet and social media. I want them to question everything that they're told. I want them to look for evidence, and I want them to think from whom, to whom, for what. So who has written this? Who are they writing it for? And what is their agenda? And only then can you cut through the nonsense that is prevalent. Because one of my other targets, which I get a little upset with, and is conspiracy theories. So I'd studied history at university, and I've got really sensible, wise, seemingly wise friends who are educated, and they are believing some of the most extraordinary things. Obviously, it was rocket propelled by COVID, Trump, the lockdown we had, and obviously the internet and social media playing its role. But I just despair, because if we cannot agree vaguely what is, reality, then we have no chance whatsoever of working together. And, of course, a real conspiracy might be that, the elites are quite happy with us if we are divided, if we are just seeing ourselves as a group of individuals, like sort of chimpanzees fighting for our bit, fighting for our status. And I find that fascinating as well, that perhaps it may be a accidental byproduct, but we are, as Thatcher said, she said famously back in the 80s, there's no such thing as society. We are just a bunch of individuals trying to get to the top, trying to, the cooperation with others is that foolishness to do with socialism and communism that had long been discredited. And unfortunately, we may have thrown the baby out with the bathwater now. If we just view ourselves, and again, my book, is hopefully exploring that concept, because a psychopath who is not impulsive, who is not reckless, and so forth, but who really considers their actions and only thinks about themselves, will probably do extremely well. And I remember there is a story actually about Bill Gates when he first met Warren Buffett at a dinner party. The first time they met, and they were asked, "What is the reason for your success?" And they both said simultaneously, "Focus." And I found that fascinating in itself, because again, psychopaths are focused on the end result, a bit like the Argentinian football team, frankly. They didn't actually succeed in the end, I'm pleased to say, but I wrote a few articles for various magazines saying England have got 3 FIFA Fair Play Awards. They've only won 1 World Cup. We are notorious, and we need to think more like the win at any cost, hand of God, you know, Argentinians, and it was kind of tongue in cheek a bit, but in some ways it wasn't. Nice guys come last sometimes. So I'm aware, Alec, that you've have faced the biggest dilemma of the book, or the biggest, shall I say, contradiction. How can you write a convincing, funny book without actually somewhat offering advice that is quite effective, actually.
Healthcare matters, but what matters most?
Having cover for the people who keep this business going.
Bonitas is there for you when it counts. Bonitas, medical aid for South Africa. Visit bonitas.co.za and find your plan.
If you'd had in your introduction, just one line from Charlie Munger saying that if you want to get to the truth, find out what you must do to not make it happen, not make it worth. In other words, invert. He talks about invert. And that's what you've done here. And you've inverted a successful life in a way that hopefully not too many people are going to read this and say, yes, I'm going to make gazillions now. And in a country like South Africa, I suppose, where 53%, there's a research report, in fact, out this morning, it says that 53% of working South Africans gamble because, and a lot of them on sport, because they can't make ends meet, or many of them can't make ends meet without somehow getting more money by having a punt. And in that way, of course, they get themselves into ever deeper trouble. And there's a lot of that in society at the moment. But when you look back on your career, just take us briefly through how you arrived as an insider and what twigged you, what made you think, no, this is not what I want to do. Because as Cityboy, you were telling an insider's story on what was going on to a world that had no idea about it, but was suspicious that why were these fellows in pinstripe suits making so much money?
Yes, so I mean, it really comes back to the fact that I should never have been in the city in the first place. They let me through by mistake. I was selling trinkets on beaches in Europe that I'd bought in India, and I'd planned to do that for 5 to 10 years. And my mother clearly thought I was going off the rails. You know, my hair was down to my arse. I had loads of earrings and a beard even more ridiculous than this one. And she got my brother who worked in the city and said, "Can you get this fella a job, for God's sake? He's, I've got 3 sons, 2 are doing okay, and the last one's, the black sheep is really not he's I'm a bit concerned about him." He got me a job and I decided to do it for 2 years because he said, "You do this job for 2 years and you will be able to live in Goa like a king for 30 years." And I thought, that sounds a really good deal. Now, after 2 years, I was earning more than my father, who'd been a public servant for 30 years. Now, I thought, okay, I'll just do 1 more year, and I did that for a further 10 years. But the interesting thing about the city is that it really, when people look at what the principal character trait that is, these financiers and bankers have, it's not greed, it's not materialism, it's competitiveness. And as soon as I found out that there were these external surveys of who the best ranked team is, I went, I want to be number one. I'm going to get this team and I'm going to make it number one. And I worked out the kind of hacks to do that. So to give you another example of ruthless manipulation, just before those voting forms arrived on the desk, I would take these lads out for £3,000 meals at Petrus, buy them a £300 bottle of champagne or whatever it might be, take them, to some of the less salubrious things that we used to do, strip joints and, et cetera, which are all well detailed in Cityboy. And, I really wanted to win. And I just thought that, okay, this is kind of giving me a purpose and so forth. But I was always querying what I was up to. Look, my dad was a Labour MP. My mum was an incredibly Christian religious lady whose parents were missionaries. I had been a bit of a hippie, so I was always questioning it. And then in 2007, I had a near fatal motorbike accident. Kind of almost ripped my knee off, my front teeth went through my lips, etc., etc. And I suddenly just thought, just a minute, life is short. You literally could get run over by a bus tomorrow, just like you almost were. You know, it's not a dress rehearsal. Come on, let's put your chips in. And then I also, of course, had earned a sufficient amount of money to kind of be okay for the rest of my life if I wasn't going to get divorced 3 times or, develop a serious gambling addiction or something. So those are what those are how I was feeling, and then just at that moment, someone offered me to do an anonymous column exposing everything, and of course, those 500,000 to 1,000,000 people in London who read that column every Friday, really, they were like I was doing a confessional really, because they were like my therapist, they just didn't realize. So I was getting it all off my chest. And then, then a publisher came and said, "Here, why don't we make a book about this?" And I was like, "Yeah, this seems like a good escape clause. I can now pivot to use the kind of trendy jargon to a new career as an author."
Well, it's well worth reading this book for what you shouldn't do. Uh, I wondered if you also drew anything from Jonathan Swift, because do you want to tell us about that?
Absolutely. So Jonathan Swift is a great British satirist. And, obviously Gulliver's Travels, where he mocks kind of, Catholics fighting Protestants by kind of comparing them to people who argue over which side of a boiled egg you should eat, the pointy end or the other end, just the absurdity of mankind. But he wrote a particular pamphlet that is really the inspiration for my book. It's called, well, the shortened title is A Modest Proposal. And this comes out in 1729, and the concept he is stating in a very deadpan, serious way is that the starving Irish, there was a solution to their problems. They should fatten up their babies and sell them as food products to their rich English landlords, and therefore get some money and be able to eat. Now, obviously, he doesn't. There's no winking at the audience in this pamphlet. He is saying it deadpan. He explains how they should be fattened up and what kind of recipes should be used and so forth. What he's doing, obviously, is highlighting the indifference of these ruling classes in Ireland, who were literally sitting back as the people around them starved to death. And in the same way, without sounding super pretentious, I'm trying to say, what has the world become that really the way to survive it now, the way to thrive as a politician or indeed as a businessman, is to act like a psychopath. So it's in that sense, it's an attack on the way of the world. It's an attack of late stage dog eat dog capitalism in a simple, in a nutshell.
We had the privilege of talking to an insider on the whole SpaceX story at the time that the mania was there, and he explained to us exactly what was going on. So I hope people in the Biz News tribe sold their SpaceX shares. I know my wife did as a result of that. Fortunately, because we've seen what's happened there. What are you, as an insider, wanting people in the Biz News tribe, our Biz News community, to take out of this book? And I really hope that your sales in South Africa go through the roof, because they deserve to.
That's kind. I mean, I think, okay, two things I think. One, I want to help people identify psychopaths, or and when I say psychopaths, I don't just mean that 1% of the population who are clinically diagnosable as genuine, empathy-free, conscience-free psychopaths. I want to be able to help people identify the tricks, the machinations of these people so they don't fall for them. So basically the idea is, you don't marry them, you don't promote them, you don't vote for them, and you can spot them in the office and you can stymie their strategies and plans. So that's one thing I hope that is possible. The other thing would be just in a more general basis to look at politicians generally, particularly, and try and work out their agenda and try and work out what they're doing to manipulate you, because I suppose it's not new news that politicians lie and manipulate and do all those things, but it seems to have been rocket propelled by modern developments. I'm talking social media particularly. It seems that either we've become more gullible, or or they're just becoming more sophisticated. And I hate to sound like a sort of miserablist and a pessimist, but with AI, and so forth, and facial recognition, and all these other tools it is going to become a harder and harder job to disentangle nonsense from reality. And as soon as that happens, then I think democracy is for the chop. And although democracy, well, what did Winston Churchill say? He said democracy is the worst system apart from all the others. Obviously, democracy has got many flaws, but you need only look at China and you need only look at Russia under Putin, and you can see that that is a place of fear and a place of something that, where it's just violence, and ultimately the violence in the system, is used. And so I'm it's a plea for humanity to just, try and understand and relish democracy and our freedoms, and try not to treat each other just as pawns in a game for our own self-aggrandizement and power and wealth.
What a wonderful way to end there, because we are seeing around the world that the autocracies are using perhaps social media, but maybe the useful idiots, to promote their systems. But it comes down to freedoms. What are your freedoms in a Western society, and what are the freedoms that you see, or the lack of them in those societies that so many seem to be admiring nowadays? Geraint Anderson is the author of How to Con Friends and Manipulate People. It's a guidebook on what not to do. Charlie Munger would say this is one to read because it shows you how to invert. And if you're an investment banker, or indeed married to one, or are friends of one, this is prescribed reading. Good to be talking to you again, Geraint, and I'm Alec Hogg from biznews.com.
Thanks, Alec. Thanks a lot.
Start your day a step ahead. Biz News Insider. It delivers the business stories that matter every morning straight to your inbox, sharp, fast, and free. Subscribe now.